had a few folks at the conference here ask me about NMA and have never heard of it before. We're kind of the American version of the organization that was described so well by Mr. Hamer in England. We date back to the middle 70s. We were formed initially as a response to the maximum 55-mile-an-hour speed limit of that period. And throughout the 70s and 80s, we were the only organization actively working for repeal of the 55-mile-an-hour limit. It seems almost impossible now that that was ever the law of the land, but it was for 13 years. But thanks in part to our lobbying efforts, we were able to get the limit raised to 65 in 1987 and finally abolished altogether in 1995. And ever since then, the maximum freeway speed limit has been slowly rising in all the states around the country. Well, many of the states, except for the northeastern block, where there's still a few 55 and 65-mile-an-hour states. That was a real lonely effort there in Washington for our people. We only had as allies the motor bus operators and eventually the truck owner operators and Independent Drivers Association. We were opposed by AAA and the auto manufacturers and pretty much every interest that was active at the time. Since then, there hasn't been a big national issue that we've had to tackle, and instead we focused on the 50 states and the tens of thousands of communities all around the country that are still chipping away at mobility in one way or another. A lot of these battles are purely local, like the issues over traffic calming and speed bumps. But the issue that I want to talk about mostly today is when local control tries to assert itself over the through routes that pass through cities. That's when a local government can do real damage to mobility on a statewide or even a national scale. To give you a few examples of this battlefront in my state of Michigan, there's a pretty serious financial upheaval going on in the state, and it's led to the reduction in revenue sharing between the state government and the local units. For one reason or another, that's been simultaneous with a doubling of the rate of traffic ticket issuance in some cities. We're still tabulating the statistics on that, but in a number of cities we're finding 200 and in some cases 400% more traffic tickets issued in the last few years relative to what had been before. In the kind of trendy inner ring suburb of Ferndale, we've had the city government actively agitate against freeway widening in more outlying suburbs. They tried actively to thwart widening I-75 in the fast-growing part of Oakland County. They seem to feel that this would be damaging to them somehow. They also activated destroying the grade separation that provides for continuous travel on Detroit's two busiest suburban surface streets, 8 Mile Road and Woodward Avenue. My personal nemesis, the city of East Lansing, that I commute through to my job at the department, actually got a lower court to agree that the city was able to impose 35 and 25-mile-an-hour speed limits on the state highways through East Lansing. That's since been reversed. I've got to point out that when I take my bicycle to work instead of my car, I take the next street over and I ride through what I call the Museum of Traffic Calming on the East Lansing residential streets there, where they have, by my count, 4 different traffic calming schemes in less than 2 blocks. The really picturesque one was one night when a mound of dirt appeared on a main street in this suburb of Auburn Hills that connects the city of Rochester Hills with the main I-75 freeway. Auburn Hills insisted that this was a park development, and they installed park benches and bushes and so forth. That's since been removed, but it took years to get rid of that one. And a fairly egregious example, we had 2 large suburbs, Canton Township and Livonia, asked that the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit be reinstated on Detroit's busiest suburban freeway, which carries about 130,000 cars a day through those suburbs, ostensibly to reduce the noise in the adjacent neighborhoods. Of course, those cities are also known for having a lot of police operation on the through freeway. These local governments just aren't interested in mobility. Their world stops at their boundaries, and if your trip crosses those boundaries, you're at risk of one problem or another. You can be perceived as an invader to be repulsed, or a pigeon to be plucked, maybe both. There's a lot of boundaries in Michigan. We have 1,203 townships and 512 cities, and a lot of those places have police departments that need to be supported. The nightmare scenario from our point of view is what happens if those city governments get a say in setting speed limits, which they have repeatedly asked for. And in fact, just before I left, 20 legislators introduced a bill to let local residents vote on every Main Street traffic control device in their town. That's residents, not voters, so every elementary school kid would get to cast a vote on what the speed limit would be or where the traffic signals go. So state legislators are capable of anything, and you have to be constantly alert for what they're up to. One of NMA's programs is to try to equip our members to fight traffic tickets. And we do put a lot of work into fighting tickets, one citation at a time, but we realize that it's much better to try to get rid of the laws at the source that enable local governments to exploit motorists. At the local level, the recipe is pretty simple. All you have to do is get involved with local politics. As painful as that may be, that's the solution to getting rid of speed bumps and chicanes and all those superfluous stop signs. But that only works if you live there. Motorists are pretty helpful or pretty helpless at reforming traffic law in each of the individual cities. So we've got to, as much as we can, move the debate uphill to the state governments. This is why we become involved in state legislation that sets the rules by which city governments can control traffic on their streets. One thing we have been doing is funneling money toward some of our members who are fighting cases that have the ability to become precedents in their state. We're willing to help out as best we can if a motorist wants to fight a citation on and perhaps set a precedent that can protect motorist rights statewide. A few of these are done under what's called the Uniform Traffic Code, or the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. A few people have mentioned that some of the traditional rules for setting traffic law are at risk of being forgotten. And the Uniform Traffic Code is one of these. It was developed laboriously back in the 1940s, codified into state law in most states, but it's at risk of being kind of walked away from by the main traffic safety agencies. There's a publication of the Institute of Traffic Engineers called the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which all states are required to adopt as a condition of federal aid. One of the recent tragedies in traffic safety is that the speed limit portions of this have been really dumbed down over the last few editions of the manual, partly at the request of local governments. Nonetheless, it's still possible to win cases in states that, as we've been described here in California, that require that speed limits be set according to a standardized methodology. So we're paying a lot of attention to the balance of power between city governments and the state government that sets the rules under which cities operate. And the balance is different in every state. And I'm not altogether familiar with what's happening nationwide beyond Michigan, but I do want to give you a few examples from Michigan. I should say a word about term limits in Michigan. I don't know how many of you are from term-limited states, but in Michigan, the state legislators are limited to just 3 terms in the House and 2 in the Senate. And we're finding that the local governments are the farm team for producing state legislators, and once they get into the state house, they immediately begin thinking about returning back to their berth in the city councils. And we find that term limits have really shifted the balance of power toward local governments. Not absolutely, though, and there's been a few triumphs that I want to talk about too. It is a hard. It's been a hard struggle for NMA. That our experience has been the same as that of the British organization. In Michigan, there's 7 million drivers. NMA has about 300 members in Michigan, like we do in most states. For some reason, organization and auto drivers just don't seem to get together very much. We never have found the strategy for turning this huge population of auto drivers into a political force. What we find instead is that these huge numbers of drivers makes us a target, not a force. Because city governments and the state government realize that they only need to exploit all drivers a little bit, or to hold up just a tiny fraction of the 100,000 people circulating through a city every day in order to balance the state or local budgets. And what governments find is that as long as they don't get too greedy, they don't upset the equilibrium between inertia and intolerance and irritation that makes people get organized and fight. We do find that greed is going up, though. In Washington, D.C., they're making between $200,000 and $300,000 off of single traffic camera installations, taking up to $60 million from Virginia and Maryland motorists through speed cameras, in effect turning the traffic law into a commuter tax. In Michigan, we've had one real obnoxious event. 4 years ago, they passed a series of surtaxes on certain traffic offenses. Additional mandatory fines of between $400 and $2,000 for various offenses. The worst of which is a $1,000 surtax on getting caught driving without a license. If your license has been suspended, say for a failure to answer a speeding ticket, the next time you're pulled over, you're subjected to a maximum $1,000 penalty, mandatory. So if a poor person can't answer that first ticket, they risk entering this, what we call the driver's debtor's prison. And by my count, there are now about 100,000 people who are so in debt to the state in Michigan that they can never get their driver's license back. Laws like this are on the books in New Jersey, where Michigan copied theirs from, in Texas, and it spread last year to Virginia, although there's a big rebellion going underway in that state. I want to talk a bit about the legislative environment that produced that. What happened was there was a coalition between conservative crackdown on everything legislators and liberal tax everything legislators, and they found that they could form common cause and basically create a new sin tax. And drivers are at risk of being turned into sinners by these laws. I want to make mention of one really unique event that happened in the last year in Michigan. What was accomplished there was a reform of the state enabling law for setting speed limits. Michigan now has what I would consider to be the nation's best law for restoring systematic setting of speed limits. It's exactly the kind of law that NMA would write if we were in charge, but we didn't do this one. It was done entirely by the Michigan State Police. what happened was a legislator, another term-limited beginner, went to the state police asking for their advice as to how they could enact a law that would impose 25-mile-an-hour limits pretty much on every street in their jurisdiction. And the state police said, well, we've got maybe a better idea than that we want you to consider. And what they managed to sell was a requirement that the law on the state highways and county through roads be set with fairly strict adherence to the 85th percentile rule, which had always been the law in Michigan, but it was one of these precedents that had been allowed to kind of fall into disuse. And then for what's called the prima facie limit on city streets, they required that the limit be set according to a table of the frequency of driveways and cross streets. And what the table returns is a value of either 35 or 45-mile-an-hour limits for most city streets. For example, the street outside this hotel would be required to be set at no less than about 45. Or a city could conduct a traffic survey by the means that you've heard described here, where you would take preferably a non-detectable method such as a LiDAR gun and survey the actual operating speeds and adhere to the 85th percentile rule. It was a really unique piece of legislative maneuvering. NMA helped out a little bit as the state police edged it through. And the result was about a year ago today, just about every city street speed limit in Michigan was invalidated and reverted to the state's standard default of 55 miles an hour, which nobody took note of. The tickets continue to be written, and that's pretty much what was intended, because both the state police and NMA were real fearful of the legislative revulsion that would occur if all these cities realized that all their speed traps had gone out of business. Although that's exactly what the police wanted, the state police wanted, and the first court cases are now making their way into court, and the first stories are now getting onto some TV stations pointing out that over the last year a lot of people have paid speeding tickets that were completely bogus. So we're hoping to tread that boundary between a gradual revision of city speed limits and a rebellion by city governments that might overturn the law. And in fact, there was one minor repeal of the reform that had to be vetoed by the governor already last year. So it remains to be seen how that one's going to play out, but every once in a while you do win a round. And in this case, it could be a real big round. I want to close with just a couple of comments along the line of John Forrester's about just what the motivation is for anti-motorist efforts on the behalf of cities. Frequently it's the money, especially when they say it's not the money. When they say it's about traffic safety, that's when they really mean to balance the budget. But what I think I've detected, and what may be true of some of the other things you've heard described here today, is that what these neighborhood associations are really doing is marking their territory. The Museum of Traffic Calming is on a street that gives access to the city high school. And what you've got are a lot of homeowners trying to defend their street against these marauding high schoolers. And if you've got two identical streets where they're agitating for traffic calming on one but not on another, you might find that one street is something that is giving access to a neighborhood by people whom the residents think shouldn't be there. The phrase that you should watch out for is our streets. When somebody says those people are driving fast on our streets, what they're doing is defending themselves against these marauders that they perceive. And this is the one impulse that I've so far found no solution to. The state police accumulated a really terrific body of statistical evidence over how effective their program to raise the speed limits on all Michigan highways has been. But I watched them try to explain this to the East Lansing City Council, and they just couldn't do it. They kept asking these East Lansing folks, what traffic problem you're trying to solve? You know, tell us what accident problem you're having here and we'll find a solution. And they said, well, all we want are lower speed limits. They just could not express it in terms of a problem to be solved. They just wanted lower limits. And I think when you see that impulse, that what you're facing is this religious impulse to campaign against auto use. And what I wish I could ask some of these guys is, you know, are you so committed to traffic safety that you don't care how many people you have to kill to demonstrate this? Because I've several times this week heard of people advocating traffic safety, or what they say are traffic safety strategies that are actively antithetical toward traffic safety. And I don't know what the solution to that is, but I know that we've got to keep fighting this religious anti-car impulse. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned before the car manufacturers are not supportive of you. I'm just curious, I mean, are they not pro-motorist or pro?
It's been a real source of frustration to me, especially coming from Michigan as I do, where the 3 American manufacturers are headquartered, that they will not act as advocates for their customers.
Because the government contracts, are they scared of what is it?
There's a number of reasons. One is they feel they can mitigate their liability for crashes by cracking down on the use of their own product.
Got it.
There's been a bit of turnaround lately on the behalf of the Toyota company. Only very recently have they've actively begun resisting the federal CAFE standard, which I think is a real bellwether for how things are going to go.
Aarne, when you described these punitive sin punishments, you described them as having been enacted by a coalition of conservatives and liberals, and it struck me that this is rather strange way to classify those people. And could you elucidate? Because it doesn't seem applicable to, say, liberals. I don't know why.
Well, the situation that produced the $1,000 surtax on driving while suspended in Michigan, it was originally a Republican bill aimed at allegedly cracking down on repeat offenders.
Yes.
And I saw the day it was introduced how it was all going to come out, and I knew that we'd be facing these tens of thousands of disenfranchised drivers who are pretty much out of the legal economy because they can't move around, especially in rural areas. But it took effect, and they began issuing about around 100,000 suspensions a year, only about half of which are being paid off. But now that the problem has surfaced, the defenders of the law are the party in power is now the Democrats, who are absolutely unwilling to give up that revenue. So it's what I call a recipe for sin tax.
So it is a revenue issue then.
Yeah, to the tune of about $150 million a year.
Yeah.
Which would be 300 if they could collect all the billings, but these people simply aren't able to pay these huge levies.
Do they have bench warrants on these people?
No, they're people whose license has been suspended.
But the second time they don't show up, does that not lead to a warrant? Or?
Every time they get arrested for driving while suspended, it's another $1,000. And some people are now $3,000 and $4,000 and $6,000 and $8,000 in debt.
Any other questions? We have about 5 minutes.
Yeah, no, I'm not. Yeah, sure. What happens nationally with the fact that, as I recall, in the late 60s, early 70s, there were places, at least in California, that we were warned with speed traps. In other words, the city made a significant amount of revenue just ticketing out of city people driving through that city. And you'd have police who were dedicated to doing that to make revenue. And then I thought that that had somehow been changed, the way the revenue from tickets, at least in California, had been changed, so it wasn't as lucrative for cities to do that. Is that, am I correct?
Well, the speed traps are still there. The really notorious ones have a tendency to get busted up. The way we describe it is that every town is a speed trap to some extent. These little notorious burgs where 50 or 60 or 80% of the city budget comes from traffic fines are pretty rare. And quite a few states do actually have ordinances against that, or state laws. There's no such state law in Michigan, but it's just kind of an endemic chronic problem that's always there at some low level. And if some city gets really greedy, then they have a tendency to get smacked back down through public outrage. But this is what I call the equilibrium between pain and organization.
Do you know what city it was that they had bought the metering camera devices for red light running? A picture was taken if you ran a red light. However, the camera was set up and the lighting was timed so that you couldn't make it through on the yellow without getting a ticket. If you were in the intersection and it turned yellow, you were not going to make it. And so it was a big scam, so that has set back the use of that kind of thing in California because...
Yeah, traffic cameras are what I call giving the local government an ATM machine connected to your bank account.
How many do we have, by the way? I'm just curious. Do you know any facts on that?
It's nowhere near the disaster that it is in England that you heard about this morning. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact number, but I believe it's close to 200 cities now in this country. It's probably between 1 and 200. Red light cameras are kind of the foot in the door for the really big money maker, which is speed cameras. And it's right now I would say that the camera forces are winning only about half the battles. Right now it appears to be evenly matched between the pro and anti-camera struggles in both the courts and the political sphere.
But wasn't it Virginia and also in San Diego where the amber lights, I think that's what Michael was talking about,
yeah.
amber lights were timed too short to the speed limit.
I can't remember the California city, but the typical scam for red light cameras is to have a grossly substandard yellow phase.
Yes, that's what it was. So you couldn't make it, so you were given a ticket for red light, even though you were fully in the intersection when the yellow light came on.
Right, and then investing on that.
They went through
Those were that law was passed in Hawaii, and then just a civic outrage at the cameras caused the legislature to just reverse the action. It was quite amazing to see the civic outrage, your citizen outrage at that.
Yeah, it's been reversed in Ohio and Virginia too, like I said.
In Oakland, California, there's a plan to convert a lake that goes alongside Lake Merritt. It's convert this two-way road from 4 lanes to 2 lanes and make them a little wider. But my questions were, first, do we know of any data on such conversions from many lanes to fewer lanes? And secondly, do we know of cases where motorists have been able to fight such efforts?
It's a real big topic. 4 to 2 lane conversions, I must say I've never heard of until I saw the horrifying bus lane photos this morning. 4 to 3 lanes are fairly common. It was a big debate in East Lansing, Michigan, of all places, where they actually thwarted a 4 to 3 lane conversion after having done quite a few beforehand recently. And there are a lot of data on that approach.
May I speak on that one?
Yeah.
We can open it now for general questions. We only have about 8 minutes.
The bicycle advocates have got involved in this, and they call it road dieting. And the data, as far as I know, there ain't any.
Is there any?
Common sense was telling you it's going to congest things.
I'd like to comment on that. They did that to Marin Avenue, which goes from Berkeley through Albany to the freeway.
Yep.
And it was originally parking on each side, which is still there, and 2 lanes with just a striped lane in the middle. And so you got traffic going 2 lanes one way, 2 lanes the other. And people in Albany wanted to basically stop people from Berkeley, what they said, speeding through. However, the consultant they hired said, well, you've got to put a center strip, which is for left turn lanes, side strip on each side, which cars can go straight through on. And then they did put a bicycle lane in for better or ill. But what the good thing is, you can actually turn right in the bicycle lane. And I was opposed to that originally, but I must say, it's actually worked, I think, better, because now, if you're driving one direction or the other, you're not stopped by cars turning left or turning right, which you were before when there were 2 lanes. And you're actually on a straighter shot, whereas, and I actually think it's worked out better. But it's not as though they were even trying to decrease the capacity. And I'm not sure that it's decreased the amount of driving or the speed, but it does appear to be safer. I will say that. I think it was actually a good combination. Now the bike lanes I'm not sure about.
The 2-way left turn lanes in the center, in many situations, work better than having 2 lanes each side going one direction, for the precise reason that you stated. What the actual flow capacity change is, I don't know. But it does make it more convenient for quite a few of the drivers who are using it.
Yeah, Bill?
Aarne, could you say more about the nature of the objection to red light cameras and speed cameras? Is it that there's too much governmental cheating going on, or that the speed limits are unreasonable? I mean, on the face of it, the speed limits are reasonable, or if our laws about running a red light are reasonable, what's wrong with enforcing it that way?
To talk about red light cameras first, NMA believes that we might not even have any objection against red light cameras if the yellow phase is set properly. We think that if an intersection is properly designed, then there's no reason to fear having a red light camera. What we're afraid of is that city governments are going to want to install these cameras instead of doing the 8 or 10 other things they should be doing before installing cameras to improve the signalization. Because you need to have appropriate capacity first, you need to have properly sized signals, you need to have backing plates on the signals, you need to remove the visual clutter that keeps you from seeing the signals, you need to have appropriate lane striping, you need to have the left and right turn lanes properly striped out, you need to remove competing driveways. These are all the things you should be doing to make the intersection safe before you install the stupid camera.
And may I say a bit also about it? You've heard a lot about private-public partnerships, didn't we, as an admirable thing. Well, they aren't always, because these things are a private-public partnership in which the people who, they may not actually physically make the cameras, but the people who sell them and who manage them, they get a cut in the revenue. So it is a public, so they have the incentive to get these things set in and get them set in and operate them improperly. That's
an incentive that should not exist.
Michael, can you tell us a little bit about Highway 50 in Virginia? There's a highway where they're actually putting raised devices down. I mean, and that's where it's going, which is no surprise to Malcolm, because that exists. They have traffic calming on arterial and on some rural highways, right? Right, and that's where we're headed. And that's why I so much wanted Malcolm to come to show us where we're headed. I mean, you're just, one step ahead of us. So, can you just briefly?
Yeah. Before I do that, I want to reinforce the points that Aarne has made. It's not so much the cameras; it's the cameras in combination with improper traffic control devices. Two personal examples. I got a $240 fine for going through a yellow light in Beaverton, Oregon. Now, I did the research and I looked at the standard. What I said to the judge was, the signal timing you have here, this is a state highway, even though it's a city-imposed signal timing, you're in violation of the national standards for the clearance interval, which is the yellow and the all-red phase. And also, yes, I did go through on a yellow light, and that's okay under your state law if I felt it was a safe thing to do. Well, I got the fine knocked down by half, but that's about all I did. The judge said it was irrelevant that they were in violation of national standards. And I said to him, well, what do you mean? It means your traffic signal is in effect illegal, so you can't impose anything. The other thing that's been noted is the business of, there are also engineering standards for warrants for stop signs. I was helping out a friend of mine, a Vietnamese refugee, who got a ticket for going through an all-way stop in another part of Oregon. And I pointed out that intersection, the volumes, violate the national standards for stops. There should be a stop sign there. It's illegal. So these things happen. Now, about Virginia Route 50, okay? All right.
You can just hold it.
All right. I'll hold it. There was a plan being developed to alter a significant regional highway in northern Virginia that goes from the D.C. area to the west to the mountains, and have 10-foot travel lanes and have 7-foot parking lanes next to it, and also put in, I think, some speed cushions or something like that. Now, yeah, well, there are a number of problems with that. One is that you're talking about a highway that carries a lot of heavy vehicles, recreational vehicles, trucks, whatever. It's not terribly appropriate when we have wider, heavier vehicles than ever before that we narrow the lanes and have these cushion devices. More importantly, we have decades of research into the relationship between accident rates and lane width that show that 10-foot lanes are going to have a fantastically higher accident rate than 12-foot lanes. 12-foot lanes are our general standard. Now, it just so happens that I come from a place where we had a 1930 state highway called Route 303, New York, that has twice the accident rate of your typical arterial New York. It has the highest accident rate in the county. Well, what is the highway made out of? It's made out of 10-foot lanes and no median left turn lane, which is another thing that they forgot to put in that, of course, makes it much more dangerous. But in the example of Virginia Route 50, it's people with no real background in traffic safety whatsoever, simply imposing these wacko ideas that they're getting from the planners and applying it toward a facility where it makes no sense. And they don't seem to realize that what they're doing is they're basically going back to the way highways were built in the early 20th century before we knew how to do it right and when the vehicles were very small and very narrow.
Yeah. Any other questions? It's 10 after. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to comment on the yellow light. The I always take to the hypothesis when an automobile writes on the magazine writes on something. But he said exactly what he said, that the original contract for the red light actually had a stipulation that the yellow light could not be increased under the life of the contract, which they subsequently dropped when people discovered that this was actually there. He claims that when looking at the accident statistics, they claimed the accidents would go down at red lights, but then they were only looking at the camera at within the intersection and not at the number of rear ends. So as soon as people started getting traffic tickets, started stopping hard at the red light, they got rear-ended. And he said that all the cities in North America that have put in red lights, only one has actually audited the claims made by the company making the red light system. to determine if accident rates had actually decreased. So they always claim that accident rates decreased. That was Winnipeg, and they found that the accidents had actually increased. And
That's kind of,
yeah.
I'd like to thank our panel, and I'd like to point out that we have membership applications for the National Motorist Association. This is a public service announcement on the pre-table, and also an example of our newsletter. So we really appreciate your consideration. Okay? Thanks.